My husband went to the post office every Thursday at 2 p.m. for 35 years. It was one of those small certainties that stitched our days together. The world could shift. The neighbor could move away. I could misplace my glasses for the third time that month. But Thursday at 2, Roberto's hand on the doorknob, his muttered goodbyes, the soft click of the screen door, meant everything was in its place. I used to say that if every family had one ritual as dependable as that, perhaps the world would not feel so brittle. We had built our life brick by brick. I taught history for 30 years at the high school down the street. I liked structure and timelines, how small choices led to large tides. Roberto worked with numbers in his own quiet way. He balanced bills, filled out forms, made sure the property taxes were paid. He liked lists, paper clips, and the neatness of bills stacked by due date. To him, the post office was as ordinary as church. He would go, come back with a bag of mail, and we would sort it together over chipped coffee cups. It was domestic choreography. His part, my part. I trusted that choreography because I had practiced it with him for decades. Perhaps that trust is why the betrayal felt like a structural collapse instead of a bruise. The first moment, when the ordinary was cleaved by the extraordinary, took place on a Monday in late October, with the sky low and heavy like an old cloth. Roberto was at the sink, trying to rinse a stubborn pot. I was in the living room folding laundry. The washing machine hummed. The clock on the mantel said 1:12. He turned, reached for the pot, and his face, the face I had known for 50 years, went slack. He clutched at his throat as if something had been stolen from him. One foot anchored, the other slid. He did not cry out. He crumpled to the linoleum, and his hand scraped along the floor, as if searching for the doorknob he'd just left. "Roberto!" I remember my voice as both my own and someone else's, a teacher's command that I suddenly could not control. I called 911. The neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who had always liked my lemon pound cake, ran over and kept talking to him like one talks to a living thing to wake it. "Mr. Beto, breathe. Beto, look at me." He did not look. His mouth worked a little. That's what scared me the most. When the EMTs came, they moved like a tide, efficient and unhurried until that moment when the bell rang and everything sped up. They checked pupils, time of onset, the whole litany that people in hospitals repeat until noises become rote. At the ER, they told me it was an ischemic stroke. They said words like right side paralysis and aphasia. The doctor's face, young, professional, steady, kept creasing and re-creasing. He offered options and possibilities, and each time I nodded as if I understood, though I had been a history teacher, not trained in the language of arteries and clots. The hospital smells like disinfectant and compressed air, with the faint undertone of coffee that never seems hot enough. I remember the monitors, soft, insistent alarms that felt like punctuation marks in a sentence I couldn't read. I held Roberto's hand. It was cool, smaller than I remembered. He blinked but could not form words. One corner of his mouth sagged. A nurse adjusted a pillow. We signed papers we did not read. I promised him, in a voice that surprised me with how calm it could be, "I will take care of everything." I meant more than the immediate things, the calls, the forms, the insurance checklists. I meant the life we had cobbled together. I meant the rhythm of Thursday at 2. If you had asked me then how everything would unravel, I would have said I had no idea. I believed, truly, that nothing secret could survive in a life as ordinary as ours. We were not people of theater. We did not hide double lives behind vacations and burner phones. We had a garden that never pretended to be grand, and a wedding band that was dented from years of use. We were, for all our small faults, plain. Yet secrets have a special talent for nesting inside the most ordinary rhythms. Routine is excellent camouflage. The first oddity appeared 2 days after the stroke, while Roberto was still in intensive care. Between visits, I carried bags to the car, sat in the visitor's lounge, and absent-mindedly sorted through the stack of envelopes and invoices that had accumulated on our kitchen table. The mail had always come to our house, to our name, but some of the letters began with unfamiliar headers, small, cramped prints in the language of demand. I put them aside, thinking I would deal with them after the day's rounds. That night, exhausted, I fell asleep in a chair by the bed. He slept fitfully, and in the morning the physical therapist arrived and moved his limbs with a tenderness that felt like a kind of rearranging of the world. It was on the next Thursday that the real test of the ritual came. 35 years is a long time for a habit to set its roots. For as long as I can remember, at 1:45 p.m., Roberto would stand, take his keys, always the same brass key on a leather fob, and announce, "I'll be back with the mail." Sometimes he left for the post office in his work shirt and mismatched socks. Sometimes he took his hat if the sun was high. On that Thursday, he did not go. I sat in the hospital parking lot like a woman performing a silent litany. He had been moved to a private room with a window that looked out on a gum tree. The therapist had placed a small notepad on the nightstand, with a pen tethered by a string. He could not write. His right hand did not obey. The notepad remained a mute witness. At home, after the nurses left and the bed rails clicked softly into place, I did what I had done for years when something in our life wanted cheering. I opened a cabinet for the biscuits, brewed a pot of coffee so tenderly that the house seemed to perk. There was a drawer where Roberto kept oddities, batteries, spare stamps, an old brass key that had belonged to a locker at the community center. I opened it and found under a packet of sugar another small brass key on a faded fob with the number 402RC painted in black. There is an odd hush when you hold an object you do not recognize in a place you once thought transparent. The key sat on my palm and felt like an accusation. I had never seen it before. We had keys to the car, keys to the garden shed, keys that jingled with decades of habit. This one was not one of them. On impulse, call it curiosity, call it the teacher's compulsion to investigate, I decided on a Thursday at 1:30, before visiting hours started, to walk to the post office myself. The town post office sits on a low corner where the streetlight flickers at night. It's a building with pigeon-tailed gutters and a sliding glass door that always sticks a little in damp weather. I kept my steps measured. My hands were a little shaky. The sun was thin that day. The line inside was short. I watched the clock, then the counter where the mailboxes sat behind a metal gate like a miniature honeycomb. Each box had a number and a little slot for a name or for the rusted brass plate of old lives. I turned the key. It fit. The tumblers inside clicked with such domestic ordinariness that for a moment I laughed at myself for being dramatic. The door pulled open and the smell of paper and rubber bands, the smell of other people's lives, rolled out like a gust. Inside, the box was not as I imagined. It was full. Not a polite handful, but a small deluge of envelopes, thin packets, notices with urgent fonts. I brought them home in a paper grocery bag, because that is what I do when I carry fragile things. It is practical and also strangely reverent. In the kitchen, under the same clock that had counted our Thursdays for decades, I opened the first envelope. The first one was a notice from a small consumer finance company. It was stern, but not theatrical. It spoke of arrears and accumulated figures. The numbers made me dizzy because they were not trivial. Another envelope was from a card company, not in my name, but with my daughter's listed as a contact, Fernandez. A third contained a statement marked with the logo of a local lending operation I had never heard of before. There were letters with no return address, just an abrupt demand. My hands, which had once chalked notes onto blackboards for classes of teenagers, now shook as I read. I read aloud because speech keeps terror at bay. "This is a notice of overdue balance," I said. "This is a notice of intent to garnish." I could not make the words feel ordinary. I had lived most of my life solving puzzles by dates and archives. I tried to trace patterns. There were more envelopes than one person could keep secret. There were slip shirts with tiny penciled sums. There were bedding stubs, small crumpled slips on carbon paper that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and the cheap ink of late nights. There was a small notebook, pages filled with columns, dates, numbers, 3 columns of amounts that climbed like ivy. And there was a name that threaded through like a stitch, Dr. Valdir. It appeared on payment instructions, on handwritten notes in the margins of a ledger, on a stamped receipt. It wasn't a professional title. It was a person's name attached to the kind of small, predatory finance that eats away at ordinary households. I read the name and felt the room tilt. How many times in a life do you have to hear a name and realize it changes everything? I sat down on the kitchen chair and the coffee went cold. I called Lucas before I called anyone else. He is our eldest, steady, with a head for spreadsheets, and the impatience of a man who has always preferred action over late-night worry. He picked up on the second ring, and I tried to tell him gently that something was wrong. "Mom, breathe," he said, practical as ever. "Where are you? Can you send me pictures?" I did. I photographed the notices, the bedding slips, the notebook with its columns that looked at once like devotion and like an indictment. He said nothing for a long time, and I understood that his mind was already working through scenarios. He is not a man of grand gestures. He is a man who drafts lists that will make the frantic orderly. I called Fernanda, too, but she did not pick up. That worried me more than anything. Her bond with her father is a different thing than Lucas's. She idolized him in a way that made her blind. I left a message that tried to be neutral and failed. "Nanda," I said into the phone. "Call me if you can." A line of small lies emerged before I hung up. The cover, I told myself, was that I would sort the mail and meet them later for coffee. I stood in my kitchen with a paper bag of other lives and a key that had been kept from me because the world had decided I was not meant to know this corner of our life. The weight of the envelopes pulled the truth into a focus that made the rest of the day slow. I read a statement that named a policy, an insurance policy that I remembered signing years ago when Roberto and I had talked about plans we would grow into like a garden. If anything, it would pay for certain expenses. Now there was a stamp across a copy of the document that said, in conservative official script, that the benefit had been assigned. Assigned to Dr. Valdir. I sat very still and tried to remember the ordinary language we had used. Did a signature on a line mean that someone had the power to take what we believed would be ours at the end of a long life? My training as a teacher made me want to catalog facts and not infer beyond them. But facts have a way of leaning on one another until common sense collapses under their weight. The kitchen chair made a sound when I stood up. The house felt suddenly like a theater set where someone had rearranged the props while I was backstage. I made a list, the things my husband would do, things only he could authorize. I checked the bedside table for a folder labeled Documents. I had always trusted that the papers that mattered would be where he had said they were. He was methodical, but not secretive. As I opened the drawer in his little home office, an old wooden pen case slid forward and brushed against my fingers. Inside, beneath receipts and a pair of bifocals, something else waited. A small stamped notice that looked like an official document from the municipal registry. It had been folded twice and carried a faint coffee stain. The envelope was addressed to Roberto, in handwriting I recognized at once. his looping late-life script for dry matters. The notice inside was short and brutal. Notice of intent to execute mortgage. Auction to be held in 20 days. My mouth went dry as dust. 20 days! In patterns of life, 20 days is both an instant and a sentence. It was not the end. We could perhaps fight. But it was close enough that I could see the headline of loss if we did not act. I did the math in my head in the way of a woman who once graded finals and now graded survival. Auctions, legal filings, potential claims, all against the brittle resources of a family whose main capital had been the house itself. The house was not just wood and brick. It was the memory of our wedding night, the bathroom tiles that had once cracked and been patched with loving care, the backyard where Lucas and Fernanda had learned to ride bikes. The idea of losing it felt like losing the spine of ourselves. The notebook with bedding stubs kept whispering something about the shape of the ruin. There were percentages, entries that looked like installments, and a red ink notation. Policy assigned as collateral. Once again the name, Dr. Valdir, appeared in the margin next to a number with too many zeros for a household budget that had never been adventurous. What does it mean to have the thing you thought would be a safety net used as the rope that ties you to a creditor's will? I had been a teacher who lectured about hauntings in history, how people had thought themselves secure until the past arrived with a list of obligations. Here, the past was very literal. Signatures, papers, the weight of what had been signed. I remember the sound of the door when Lucas arrived. Quick, efficient. He took the envelopes out of my hands and spread them on the kitchen table, like an experienced surgeon laying out instruments. For the first time since Roberto's collapse, I felt something like a cool-headedness that was not mine. He photographed documents with his phone, typed notes into a spreadsheet I had never seen before, and said the words I both needed and dreaded. We need to know what's legally binding and what was forged. His tone was a sort of thin rope, taut, necessary. Fernanda arrived later, breathless from a bus and carrying a bag with too many personal effects, a sweater, a pot she insisted on bringing though she had no place to put it now. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, eyes red, and when she saw the stack of envelopes her face went bone white. She told me that she had thought a bill marked in her name was a mistake, that she had called the company and they had told her she was liable for a card she had never applied for. The betrayal freighted her voice with a small, private horror that I recognized as the particular pain of a child whose faith in a parent is unmoored. "He must have used my name," she whispered. "He would do that for me." She wanted to defend him, as children do, even when the evidence had started to file itself like dust across the furniture. We spent the evening in a kind of ritual triage. We catalogued envelopes, blacked out numbers with a marker, so we would not be tempted to read other people's private digits in the name of curiosity. We put aside the things that were clearly in my name, and the things that were clearly not mine. Lucas called a lawyer he knew through work, not to promise we could stop the auction, but to buy us some time, and to understand what the notices meant in practice. I felt both grateful and small. The lawyer used words like lien, assignment, and secured interest, and each sounded like a different species than the language of home. At 2 p.m. the house felt raw with absence. It should have been the hour that Roberto reached for his keys. The empty ritual sat in the doorway like an accusation. I could no longer think of Thursday without the image of a brass key turning in a tiny lock and the slow delivery of envelopes that would become our undoing. I sat at the table and put my hand on the notebook with its columns. Counting the number of entries felt obscene and intimate at the same time. I thought about how a life small and repeated choices, on the surface nothing but paper, had been quietly funneling resources away from us. Around midnight I walked back to Roberto's room in the hospital and found him staring at the ceiling, eyes fishing for a sentence he could not catch. He had a small bandage at his temple, where they'd inserted an IV earlier. His lips made the shape of a syllable and failed. I sat down by his bed and took his left hand, the hand that still had warmth, and told him, in the soft teacher's cadence that had soothed teenagers through failed exams and broken homes, that I would be all right. His eyes flicked to mine, and in them a spark of recognition flared, small and human. He tried to press my fingers, but the motion was clumsy. He pressed his forehead against the sheet like a man who remembered the shape of the world without the language to name it. I did not know then the full measure of the debts or the mechanics of the lending that had gathered around his name like vines. I only knew the shapes: envelopes, a key, a notebook, a name that smelled like loan offices and threats. I only knew that the ritual that had comforted me for decades was now the delivery method for a secret that could devour our home. For the next few days, the ritual of visiting the hospital and sorting the paperwork became my new curriculum. I learned how to pace myself through the small horrors: a statement with a late fee, a letter demanding payment within 10 days, an unfamiliar contract with a signature that might or might not be ours. I trained my fingers to turn pages gently, to photograph documents with a steady hand, to fold them in a manner that both preserved and controlled them. I became a woman of lists because sometimes survival is a matter of putting one thing after another. Still, there were moments that were simply raw. I would sit on the back porch with the afternoon light cooling and hear a neighbor's dog bark and feel a piercing grief so sharp I thought it might bruise. I remembered our wedding day, how people had danced with sticky sweat and laughter, how the priest had mispronounced a name and I had nudged Roberto with my elbow. I remembered how we had closed the mailbox on the same morning we moved into the house, how we had posted a card to his mother that said simply, "We're home." All of that felt like currency that trade had suddenly exposed as counterfeit. Toward the end of the first week, I decided we could not be passive. The idea of waiting for the auction to roll toward us like a natural disaster was intolerable. But before action comes knowledge. So we learned how to read the language of predatory lending without letting it become our master. We called the insurance company listed on the policy, but I will not give the sound of that call the gravity it would achieve later. In those days it was mostly a paper trail and a polite response that did not comfort. We learned, painfully, that designating a policy as collateral could be done with signatures and notations that looked official. We learned that an unscrupulous lender could engineer paperwork that appeared legal and yet was deeply coercive. We learned that the human mind can be both lender and predator when desperation or habit has been cultivated for years. Between phone calls and visits and frantic note-taking, the motif of Thursday persisted like a metronome. Sometimes, to quiet my mind, I would imagine what might have driven him to the post office so persistently. Was it habit? Pride? An addiction that had crept past all the guardrails we thought we had in place? Once I found a small paper tucked into his wallet, a line of numbers with tiny check marks that looked like bets arranged by date. The handwriting was his, neat, almost affectionate. I had loved that handwriting my whole life. There is a particular kind of anger that is not hot, but cold and precise. It does not scream. It catalogues. It says methodically, "Why?" and then lays out the answer in small, particular ways. I felt that anger. I watched my hands write the same question across a dozen sticky notes and placed them around the kitchen. Notes to make me do the things a woman in this theater of life must do. Call the bank, photograph documents, ask a friend for temporary help. I did not let myself imagine the auction day as anything but a technicality to be postponed. But postponement, of course, is not the same as salvation. One Thursday afternoon, a week after the first discovery, I went back to the post office with Lucas and Fernanda. We opened the box together. It felt wrong, like trespassing in the grammar of his life. But legal obligations had a way of requiring gritty intimacy. The mailbox's steel cheeks were cold. The interior, when we emptied it, gave up more envelopes, more statements, and a small stack of handwritten notes bound with a rubber band that smelled faintly of old rain. Lucas, who had always liked to arrange things into columns, began sorting and making lists. Fernanda, who still held on to a childlike hope that their father had been only capricious, wept into the sleeve of her jacket when she read a notice showing an account opened in her name. At that moment I understood the architecture of the ruin with a clarity that made me physically ill. Routine as camouflage. Roberto's steady departures to the post office had been the perfect courier for this secret life. Envelopes that belonged to other institutions passed through the same aperture as our ordinary bills. What looked like a simple errand had been, for decades, a channel. The very thing that had comforted me, that small, repeating gesture, was the thing that enabled the predator to operate unnoticed. We sat there, at our kitchen table, surrounded by paper and the faint remains of coffee. The clock ticked toward 2. If my life had been nothing but a string of such small rituals, I would have kept my head down and tried to mend what was torn. But the presence of the auction notice, the names attached to borrowed money, and the sign that someone had rearranged the terms of our insurance was a summons. It demanded not only that we cope, but that we fight to understand. There was one more thing in the box that made me press my fingers to my mouth. Tucked at the bottom, beneath a newsletter and a postcard with a smiling lighthouse, was a small envelope with a return address that read like a smudge of the town's legalese. Inside there was a photocopy of a deed, blurred but with a name I recognized. Alongside, written in a different hand, a single line: assigned to secure debts through Dr. Valdir. I looked at Lucas. He looked at me. For a second, no one spoke. The kitchen seemed to recede, and all I could hear was the tick of the clock. "How long has this been going on?" Fernanda whispered. I did not know, but I knew that secrets that survive within rituals have a stealth that makes them more dangerous than the loud, obvious betrayals of soap opera histories. They are quieter and therefore more corrosive. They eat away at trust grain by grain until the foundation is indeterminate. That night, I sat at my old oak desk and began to write, because teachers make lists, and because writing is the way I organize grief into something that can be handled. I wrote down every date I could confirm, every envelope number, every instance where a name matched a ledger entry. I wrote because facts felt like a lifeline. Hours later, the house dark, the clock nearing 2 a.m, another Thursday passing without the ritual. I fell asleep with a sheet of paper clutched like a talisman. When morning came, the first thing I heard was the phone. The hospital called with a shift update. Roberto had been more responsive overnight. I felt a small, guilty hope that the person I loved might find his voice. But the papers on my desk were a chorus I could not silence. On the corner of one page I had written, in a teacher's block letters, "Do not act alone." I had been a woman who trusted ritual. I was now a woman who understood that ritual can hide 1,000 sharp things. The discovery of the mailbox was not the end of the story. It was the opening of a door that let in a cold light and showed, in stark hues, what we were up against. I did not yet know how we would move. I only knew we had to. The next steps, calls to the lawyer, difficult conversations with a man who would be dangerous in his own way, and the moral decision about how and whether to care for a husband who had, without knowing it perhaps, been the architect of our peril, had not yet been made. But on that Thursday, as the clock rounded 2 and a million small, ordinary things pressed in, I stood in the kitchen with the stack of envelopes and a key branded in my memory. The ritual that had once comforted me had been exposed as a conduit. I put my hand on the brass key and felt its cold, banal weight. It had taken a long time, 35 years, for a habit to become a hiding place. Now the habit's truth had to be named aloud, and names, once said, make a lot of noise. If you value truth, if you value the hard and quiet work of listening to life's small certainties, leave a like and tell me where you're watching from. It helps to know you are there. We did not sleep that night. Instead, with coffee cooling on the counter and the TV muted like a wary animal, we began the first of many conversations that would stretch out in the weeks to follow. We gathered documents, we called numbers, and between the calls, we sat and remembered. We remembered birthdays and the way Roberto used to hum while he did the dishes, the way Lucas used to get upset when soccer practice conflicted with piano lessons, the way Fernanda once painted a bird on the back fence and waited for the morning light to admire it. Memory becomes a refuge when the present is a storm. It is what you carry when you cannot carry much else. That evening, late, Lucas left to check with a lawyer. Fernanda stayed and tried to coax something like a confession from me, not because she wanted to hurt her father, but because she needed the story to be simple enough to hold. Maybe he signed for people who asked him to, she said. Maybe he thought he was helping. The words were reaching. They were tender. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe everything that made the man I loved less culpable. But there was the ledger, the betting stubs, the assignment stamp that seemed to have been stamped with intent rather than accident. The human heart can be wide with forgiveness, but the practical world requires documents. I spent the night drafting letters. Nothing legal, only letters I might use to tell a story later if I needed to. I wrote in the voice of a woman who had taught, who had proofread exam essays until her eyes blurred, who knew how to create an argument. I dated the pages because dates matter. I made copies and kept the originals in a folder I could not let myself misplace. By morning, the hospital routine resumed. Roberto's speech was still broken. His right hand remained uncommunicative. Yet there were small improvements. His eyes would follow a finger. He attempted to smile on cue. And sometimes he would attempt a syllable that clung to the possibility of recovery. Each small victory was a splinter of light against the spreading shadow of debt. Care and betrayal, tenderness and fraud. Life shapes itself in such double exposures. It is strange how the ordinary stubbornly insists. On a Sunday morning, while the rest of the town went to church or to the farmer's market, I found myself standing in the little grocery store we frequented, holding a bag of flour as if that alone could anchor the day. At home, the living room smelled faintly of lemon from the cleaner I always used. The clock on the mantel still said 2 in the afternoon, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I started making a list of things we might sell, jewelry, some of the extra appliances in the attic, and felt a physical shrinking at the idea of parting with tangible heirs of history. Each item had a memory attached, a necklace from my mother, a watch my father had given Roberto when we married. Selling such things felt like a betrayal as well as a necessity. How do you inventory love when it must be priced? The auction notice crept like a deadline across our days. On the kitchen calendar, I wrote the date in red ink and circled it as if the circle itself could change the outcome. In the quiet hours, I tried to imagine a future that was not a headline of loss. Perhaps smaller, perhaps humble, perhaps enough. I began to imagine transforming. The image of me back at the chalkboard teaching night classes to adults with odd schedules, battered textbooks and warm fluorescent light, started to feel less like an indignity and more like a plan. I baked again, more often than before, because the oven gives an honest yield. Heat plus ingredients equals bread. The kitchen was a laboratory where the arithmetic of life made sense in a way creditors could not measure. Sugar, flour, time. One Thursday afternoon, surrounded by the evidence that had been smuggled through our ritual, I stood looking at the brass key and realized that the habit that had once comforted me had to become evidence. I walked, slowly with the weight of a woman who finally understood the scope of what she faced, back to the post office. The door stuck on the way in the same little way it always had. The boxes were the same. A woman at the counter chewed gum and greeted me as if she saw me every week. She had no idea this was the site of a small, buried life. The steel door of box 402C was cool under my hand as I turned the key. This time, the box gave up its contents with an almost theatrical abundance. Envelopes, receipts, and a little black envelope that smelled faintly of tobacco. Among them was a notice with the heading that made my heart stop. Notice of execution. The words were not culinary. They were calibrated and final. I took the papers and walked home with the feeling of a woman carrying an indictment. The afternoon sun did not feel like comfort. It felt like a stage light on a scene I had not auditioned for. When you discover a secret sewn into a ritual you loved, you do not just lose money or stability. You lose the grammar of trust that shaped days into a life. You are left to interpret the artifacts of a partnership you thought you knew. The brass key, the slips of paper, the repeated name. These became the new text I had to read and understand. Each Thursday would now arrive as a summons rather than a comfort. As I set the papers on the kitchen table, I felt both outrage and an odd tender pity settle in equal measure. The man who had gone every Thursday for 35 years had been both my partner and, in ways I could never have foreseen, the vector of our undoing. I thought of his face in the hospital, the way he had tried to press my fingers. I thought of how a person could love and betray in the same lifetime without either negating the other. There would be 1,000 steps after that Thursday. There would be awkward conversations, legal letters, the smell of car auctions perhaps, and the small business of making ends meet. There would be decisions about care, conversation with doctors, and the slow, grinding arithmetic of debt collectors. But in those first days, standing in the kitchen with the mail spread like evidence, there was only the raw beginning, the knowledge of what had been done, and the terrifying clarity that routine had been its disguise. I folded the papers, put them in a folder, and set them under the lamp that had once been Roberto's reading light. The lamp threw a small circle of warmth on the wood. Outside, the day moved as it always had, indifferent to the rearranging of our lives. Inside, the ritual of Thursday had been unmasked, and the truth once seen demanded that we act. The papers sat under the lamp for 3 days, because to touch them felt like admitting the scale of what had happened. On the 4th morning, Lucas arrived with a folder of his own, a narrow, efficient manila thing that smelled faintly of coffee in the office. He had been up late the night before, calling contacts, making lists, and now he sat at the kitchen table and spread his findings with the precision of someone solving a geometry problem. "We can try to freeze the auction," he said, voice even. "We can ask for an emergency injunction. It will cost money. We'll need a retainer." His eyes were calm, but there was a fatigue at the edges. He is the kind of person who carries his worry in the small tightening of his jaw. "We have to show there was fraud, or at least forgery. If we can show the signatures are suspect, that the assignment was coerced, we might have a case." I listened because what Lucas does best is make action tolerable. He made lists, and the lists filtered fear into tasks. But there was a line he could not reach with spreadsheets: the human face across from us. The man who held the policy, Dr. Valdir, was not a bank with a logo. He was a person who drank coffee and kept business cards and likely slept in a bed. That fact made him more daunting, not less. "You drafted a letter?" Fernanda asked, voice small. She had been quieter than the rest of us, as if her love for our father shadowed everything. She sat on the edge of the counter, knees drawn up, fingernails worrying at the hem of her sweater. Sometimes she spoke in fragments, memories mixing with denials and the need to believe. Maybe he thought he was helping someone. Maybe he signed something and didn't understand. Maybe is a dangerous word when the calendar is burning. I did not say it aloud. Instead, I folded a clean sheet of paper and wrote the things I could bear to write. Dates, letterheads, the names of institutions, the name repeated like a scar. Dr. Valdir. We moved because moving kept us from collapsing. Lucas called the lawyer he trusted and explained the situation without theatrics. The lawyer advised caution. Do not confront. Gather documents. Do not make threats you cannot back up. That instruction read like both wisdom and imprisonment. It meant practically that one of us would have to speak to Dr. Valdir without raising a hand or raising our voice to the point of breaking. The lawyer also suggested we send a simple, formal letter requesting an accounting of any assignment and any papers related to the policy. Send, wait. The word wait felt obscene. We did not have the luxury of long waits. The auction date loomed like a fixed sun. We also had a man in a hospital bed, the ghost of conversation that could not find its tongue. Walking the corridors of that hospital became a new way of counting Thursdays. The monitors beeped in new rhythms. Nurses passed with the brisk efficiency of people trained to separate facts from feeling. A young doctor with kind eyes, he always seemed slightly younger than the situation required, told me gently that Roberto's rehabilitation would be slow, that speech therapy could help him recover fragments, that sometimes improvement comes in fits and starts. I nodded because nursing hope is also a job. It was Lucas who first insisted on making contact in person. We will not go in and accuse, he said. We will ask questions. He wanted the meeting to be in a neutral place, a coffee shop where receipts could be kept and people would not feel cornered. I wanted him to bring a baseball bat. Instead, he brought a stout resolve and my old habit of asking for evidence. The coffee shop where we agreed to meet Dr. Valdir smelled of steamed milk and old paperbacks. He arrived precisely on time, wearing a muted suit that had the air of someone who wanted people to see respectability more than wealth. He smiled in a way that had been practiced. His handshake was familiar with a faint grease of someone who handled paper and cash in rooms where the light is often dim. He greeted Lucas with the careful weight of a man who knows how to appear reasonable. You must be the family, he said, and his voice slid into a register that suggested comfort. Please sit. He did not look like a villain in any caricature. He looked like a person you might trust at first glance. That was part of the trick. Lucas laid the papers out between them like a tablecloth. He did not shout. He did not cry. He presented facts in the voice of a clerk. We found documents assigning the insurance policy to you, he said. We want to understand on what ground that was done. We want the originals. Valdir's eyes did a small calculation. Assigned? I have the policy as collateral for loans I made to Mr. Roberto, he said. His smile did not crack. Mr. Roberto was a client. You understand how business works. There are legal instruments for this. His watch was cheap gold. He tapped it almost unconsciously when he spoke. Were those instruments signed voluntarily? Lucas asked. Were they witnessed? We have reason to believe some signatures may have been forged. He did not put the last part as an accusation. He placed it like a pebble in a pond and watched for ripples. Valdir's face changed, imperceptibly at first. Forgery is a strong accusation, he said. We can go through the paperwork. If there is irregularity, then we will... He paused in a way that signaled an offer, not a promise. We are businessmen. We don't want scandal. The refusal to commit was a skillful dodge. It suggested both cooperation and a readiness to litigate. I sat in the opposite chair and felt the room shrink to the space between Valdir's hand and the manila folder. There is a part of negotiations where anger must be traded for clarity, where the blade of fury is sheathed to make room for strategy. I had to become a woman who could hold her terror and parcel it into useful rage. "We will need those originals," I said. My voice surprised me, calm, teacherly, and a little cold. "We will also need a written accounting of any loans under his name, copies of any collateral agreements, and proof of identity for all signatories." Valdir stared for a long time. For all his smoothness, I thought I saw the slight tremor of someone who keeps too many loose ends. He agreed, in the cautious language of people who do not admit fault. He asked for a week to produce the materials and suggested we might find common ground. He wanted the optics of cooperation. That was something we could use, perhaps. We left with a mild victory, a promise written in civility. It is curious how often civility functions as both a bridge and a screen. Over the next days, Valdir produced papers, some neat, some suspiciously photocopied, some with signatures that looked like a hurried hand. Lucas had the signatures analyzed by someone who knew such things. The handwriting expert's report was cautious, hedged with professional language, but there were enough inconsistencies to give us hope that some documents were not genuine. The lawyer filed for an injunction. The retainer paid with money from a savings account I had kept for disasters I thought would never come. In parallel, we had to perform the practical tasks of survival. We took heirlooms to a pawnshop. That was one of the worst afternoons. The pawnshop smelled of metal and polish. A man behind the counter wore an expression that had been taught by the world. Neutral appraisal equals profit. He weighed a necklace from my mother in his hand, like an object with a past he did not belong to. "We can offer you a loan," he said without guessing the depth of what his words meant to us. We accepted less than the sentimental price of the piece. Sentiment has little market value. Fernanda came with me. She sat on a bench and watched the clerk handle our jewelry like a neutral party. "It will be temporary," she tried to comfort me, but we both knew the truth. Temporary can harden into permanent when money is grease for a machine, hungry for metal and paper. We left with a small envelope and a sense of private expropriation. Each item we parted with felt like a small surrender letter to ourselves. The hospital calls came, and the medicated mornings blurred into evenings spent with paperwork. Sometimes Roberto made small improvements. He would look at a family photograph, and a corner of his mouth would twitch like an attempt at a word. He could not sign documents. He could not say whether he remembered lending money. His silence was a haunted thing. It presenced guilt without speaking it aloud. I sat at his bedside and read passages from the textbooks I had once used, desperately trying to hold the familiar rhythms of language against the thinning grammar of his speech. Sometimes it seemed to help. Sometimes it did not. The legal processes moved with the heavy, inevitable slowness of a system built to resist sudden shifts. The injunction bought us days. During those days, Lucas and the lawyer pushed for an accounting and for any evidence Valdir had of voluntary assignment. They discovered that several documents bore signatures that, when compared to other authenticated samples, were inconsistent. We were not the only ones. There were whisperings, other names, other boxes, other families. How often does predation repeat itself under the guise of routine? The discovery made anger more precise. It narrowed the enemy from a nebulous idea into a set of papers and a person who used habit as camouflage. One afternoon, 2 weeks into this assault on our privacy, I received a call from the hospital that made my stomach go cold in a new way. Roberto had begun to show a fever spike, a complication, perhaps an infection. The doctor wanted to discuss options for rehabilitation placement, whether home care was viable or whether a specialized facility would be safer given the demands of therapy. I had been trying to imagine caring for him at home, imagining a new choreography of lifts and schedules and medicine. But an honest appraisal, my head not yet wooden with grief, told a different story. We did not have the resources for full-time home care. We did not have the strength. The conversation with the doctor was full of small, proper words. "Professional care will provide 24-hour monitoring," he said. "It is often best when coordination of therapy is required. We can help with a referral." I nodded as if I understood every implication. In the quiet of the car, I began to count in the way a woman counts when choices are arithmetic: the house, the insurance, the cost of care, the children's futures. The equation did not balance. The moral decision, whether to keep a husband in our modest home or to place him where he would have round-the-clock care, felt like the strangest kind of betrayal. How do you place a man you love behind walls you cannot afford? How do you reconcile the obligation to care with the duty to preserve a life for your children? Fernanda's face folded into a small grief each time we spoke of placement. She wanted to keep him close, to be the daughter who tended, the daughter who would prove herself worth his love. Lucas, practical and exhausted, argued for stability in numbers. I sat between them, and each decision felt like weighing a life against a ledger. In the end, I chose what I could not have chosen, without the stack of documents that had been forced upon me. I chose survival for the living. We arranged for a reputable rehabilitation clinic, a place with therapists who could attempt to restore some function and nurses who could manage medications. It was not easy to find a facility that both met clinical standards and would accept a family in our financial position. We used a portion of the retainer and a small emergency loan from a friend to cover the initial placement while the legal machinery turned. It felt both like abandonment and like deliverance. I visited every day. I sat in a chair beside his bed and read to him recipes from my head, the ingredients for a bread that does not fail, and sometimes he smiled at the cadence of words. The day of the auction was bright and merciless. People arrive at auctions with cash in pockets and interest like hunger in their eyes. Our house sat on the block like an artifact, the garden a quiet testament to years. An auction official read the terms. The house will be sold to the highest bidder after public notice. There were people, neighbors, strangers with clipboards, a couple of antique dealers who liked the old windows. I felt like I was watching an anatomy demonstration that was also a funeral. I stood at the edge of the public lot with Lucas and Fernanda and small packets of papers that were both our record and our insult. The gavel fell. The house sold for less than we had hoped. Later, someone would tell me that auctions seldom reflect sentimental value. They reflect market conditions. That sentence is true in the way that many statements are true and cold. We watched our years change hands in the measured way of public transactions, while in private the children clutched at each other, and I tried to memorize the line of the fence where Fernanda had painted the bird. There was, in the aftermath, an ugly, efficient practicality. The new owners wanted a clean house. We had to pack quickly. We sold what remained, furniture that carried the imprint of small domestic politics. The chair where Roberto read the sports section. The table where we had breakfast and where homework had been spread. The china that had been in my family. It is strange how possessions become currency in a crisis. They exchange memory for solvency. I packed what we could. A few photographs, a box of recipes, the brass key that had begun this entire saga, and which I kept in my pocket like evidence and talisman. Moving into a small apartment felt like an exile cushioned by the kindness of our family. Friends lent couches, neighbors brought casseroles. The first night I made tea in mugs I had not yet matched and slept in a bed that had been donated by someone with less story attached to it. There is a practical kind of shame in accepting help, and there is also an enormous gratitude. People who love you will show their love in thermostats fixed and casseroles delivered and offers of work. We used what we could of the recovered insurance to pay immediate debts and to clear Fernanda's name where possible. She went to the bank and sat in a chair much like the one I had sat in as a frightened young woman signing up for a credit card, and she fought. The bank, repeated in administration, is not designed to be sympathetic. It is designed to balance ledgers. Yet there are human beings inside those institutions. Clerks, tellers with empathy, who can lift small corners of a sheet of paper so light passes through. Fernanda, who had once been a girl who painted a bird on the fence, sat with a bank manager and provided a statement declaring the card fraudulent. It took time. It took letters and evidence and the lawyer's notes. But slowly her credit was cleared on certain accounts. On others, the stains lingered like watermarks. We were not, by any reasonable measure, made whole. The insurance that had been reconveyed to us was less than the mortgage. It was a sum that bought breathing space, but not restoration. It paid for rehabilitation placements, for a retainer to the lawyer, for closing balances on some accounts that had gotten too loud. It kept us fed and housed for months. It was, in the arithmetic of survival, enough to buy a beginning rather than an ending. There were aches I did not intend to publicize. The quiet shame of watching a neighbor who had known me my whole life passing by and lowering his eyes as if pity were something contagious. There were also small triumphs. Fernanda getting a part-time job at a bakery where the manager liked the way she smiled. Lucas getting a contract with a local firm that meant he could assist while keeping us afloat. I started teaching night classes again, just a few students at first. The chalk dust felt like church dust, a familiar sacrament. I baked too, at odd hours, selling loaves to neighbors and to a small cafe that liked the method in my bread. The oven was reliable in a way only machinery is. You feed it, you wait, it gives back heat and bread. It became a metaphor and a small livelihood. Our life shrank, and then quietly learned new dimensions. There were nights when Fernanda and I would sit and talk about the things we had lost and what we had to keep. We would laugh sometimes, small, brittle things, and sometimes we would be silent. In that silence, our family continued to be multiple things, a place of loss, of stubborn tenderness, of practical loyalty. Roberto's name was present in everything we did, sometimes as accusation, sometimes as memory. I would visit him in the clinic and bring him slices of bread warmed in my hands. He could not speak the way he had. He would sometimes watch me braid his hair if it had been longer, and there would be a look in his eyes that told me, without words, that he loved me still. Love in the end is not a single story. It is a tangle of choices that persist, even when the ledger is against you. There was a moment, months later, when the lawyer phoned with news that could have been a curtain call. He had managed to negotiate a release on the insurance assignment. Valdir, perhaps fearing exposure in other matters, had agreed to reconvey the title of the policy in exchange for a limited payment and a confidentiality clause. We recovered the policy in formal terms. The money was not enough to repurchase the house after auction, but it gave us legal leverage and a measure of dignity. I remember the day I signed the papers. The pen felt like a small mallet. Lucas wanted to celebrate with a bottle of wine. Fernanda wanted to bake. I bought flour instead. The victory, such as it was, tasted like warm bread, sustaining and small. Valdir faded from our daily thoughts like a specter, finishing a round of business. He remained in my inner life as a demonstration that ordinary people can be cunning when habit becomes their cloak. There were no dramatic arrests in our small narrative, no cinematic downfall. Instead, there were legal letters, a quiet reconveyance, and the slow unspooling of the man's power when confronted with the inconvenient possibility of scrutiny. That was small justice, legal, tedious, and not particularly satisfying in the way revenge is supposed to be satisfying. But it was practical. It let us breathe. Time, as ever, did not stop. Thursdays continued to arrive like oncoming trains. They were no longer a straightforward comfort. They were a bell that could toll for different reasons. On one of those Thursdays, exactly the kind that used to be Roberto's hour to go to the post office, I woke early and wrote, "Writing is a way I sort the world." I began to keep a journal of recovery, a document that catalogued appointments and small victories, a speech regained, a mouth able to shape a new sound, a shopping list completed without help. I wrote the dates in the block letters of my discipline. Recording things made them less threatening. Somehow, one Sunday, months into our new pattern, Fernanda came into the kitchen and hugged me with both her arms. "Mom," she said, "I got a permanent position at the bakery." She smelled of sugar and yeast. Her face had the kind of worn softness that comes from labor done with dignity. "It's not rich, but it's steady." Lucas sent a terse message that read like a small blessing. "We'll be okay." He had taken to calling more frequently, sending spreadsheets only when necessary, and recipes the rest of the time. Roberto's recovery progressed in fits. There were days he could not speak, and others where he would astonish me by finding a word that seemed like a gift. The clinic's therapists worked to restore speech incrementally. There were exercises, repeating vowels, naming objects, tracing the outline of a cup with a finger. Sometimes he would get frustrated and throw a hand in the air like a child tired of a lesson. On those days, I would close my eyes and imagine our wedding night in all its imperfect joy, and remind myself that the man beside the bed had been both gentle and flawed, generous and secretive. We did not reunite in the way I once imagined, two elderly people sitting in rocking chairs on a porch and speaking of the weather with perfect concord. Instead, we built a new relationship around care and caution. Visits were frequent, and sometimes he would reach for my hand and find it, his grip soft and sad. In those moments I forgave him, and did not forgive him in the same heartbeat. Love and accountability are not opposites. They are a braided rope. There is a curious thing that happens when you remake a life in smaller parts. You begin to notice the grain of ordinary days. I began teaching night classes and found joy in a student who finally read a paragraph aloud without trembling. I took orders for loaves and learned to balance my days between lessons and ovens. The smell of bread in the apartment, the scraping of trays, the soft burn of crust. These were new rituals that stitched the day into something like safety. I wrote again, not only lists, but essays, memories boiled down into sentences. Friends who had drifted back into our lives encouraged me to share my story at a small community center. I did, and people came. They sat in folding chairs and listened. There was consolation in being seen. On one of those speaking nights, a woman in the third row raised her hand. "My father used to go to the post office daily," she said. I never thought to look. She had tears in the corners of her eyes. "Your story makes me want to check things." The room was full of ordinary people, caregivers, shopkeepers, teachers, who nodded like a choir of tempered empathy. That night I felt the story of our small ruin expand into something useful. It was no longer merely a wound, but a warning and a lesson. The weeks folded into months. There were incomplete legal threads, cases pending, claims unproven. But there were also small, concrete successes. A cleared credit line for Fernanda, a modest settlement that paid for additional months of rehabilitation. The reconveyance of the policy we had feared lost. The house was gone and some possessions were sold. But we had something else. A new architecture of life that was leaner but more honest. I learned to live with certainty and with ambiguity. I learned to accept kindness and to refuse self-pity when it was tempting. I learned the practical skill of telling a story without allowing it to swallow me. The brass key, which had once been the instrument of ruin, became a kind of relic I kept in a little wooden box with my recipes. It was a reminder that rituals can be both blessings and betrayals, that to live is to be vulnerable to both. There are things I would warn you about if you came to me over coffee. Check your mail. Know where important papers are kept. Talk to your family about financial realities. But I will not offer a how-to manual. Documents are technical. Guardianship is complex. Someone else might need professional counsel I cannot give. What I can say, with the teacher's bluntness that has softened with age, is this. Listen to the small certainties in your life, and do not let them become the place where secrets hide. Rituals sustain us, but they can also be misused. The trust you place in routine should be the subject of gentle curiosity, not of blind surrender. Now, after a long reshaping, Thursday at 2 takes on a new meaning. The clock on my small apartment mantel still echoes the old house. It is a cheap clock with a character all its own. On Thursdays, I bake a batch of rolls and deliver one to the clinic. I go to Roberto's bedside with a container of warm bread and a notebook of the week's small miracles. He never returns the key to the mailbox. He sometimes tries to say the name of the man who was our creditor, and barks a syllable that is only the remnant of a name. I hold his hand and tell him about the loaves I sold, and about Fernanda's new job, and about the classes I teach. He listens. Sometimes he smiles. On the anniversary of the first Thursday that revealed the truth, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote this story down because people who teach know that history matters, both the big events and the small rituals that enable them. I wrote because the telling made the event less like a trap and more like a lesson. I wrote because the act of naming helped me to reclaim agency. I began, as I often do, with small, concrete things. The brass key, the smell of coffee, the stack of envelopes that had become evidence. I remembered the shock, the nausea, the slow arithmetic of survival, and the quiet judgments we made about care and livelihood. I remembered the auction and the empty house, and the way neighbors showed up. I remembered the peculiar kindnesses and the practical cruelty of markets. I remembered the man I loved, and the man who had betrayed us with paper. There is no tidy moral to close with. Life is a sequence, and we are often left with the job of making sense of the pages that fall out of the binding. We mourned the life that had been promised by routines and possessions. We also learned that life can be rebuilt in small, stubborn ways. We found solidarity in the people who stayed. We found work that asked little, but returned dignity. We learned that to survive is sometimes to choose the living over the ideal. If you are listening and this story has reached you, I want you to do something small. Check the mail for anything that looks unfamiliar. Ask gentle questions about the papers your loved ones sign. Talk, without accusation, about money and habits, and the things we assume are harmless. We do not need to live in suspicion, but a little vigilance is not cruelty. It is care. Thank you for staying with me. If you stayed to the end, tell me where you're watching from in the comments and share this with someone who needs to hear it. On Thursdays now, when the clock strikes 2, I bake a small loaf, and I remember how easily habit can hide harm, and how slowly, with patience and grit, a life can be rebaked into something that feeds others.